Stephen Colbert does not guess about Donald Trump's time at Wharton. Stephen Colbert looks for papers and facts. Donald Trump is getting really scared because former President Barack Obama is trying to help Democrats get seats in the House of Representatives so they can impeach Donald Trump. Donald Trump is actually scaring himself. This is because former President Barack Obama is leading a campaign to vote yes. This is a response to what Donald Trump did to make some Republican states bigger. When the doors are closed at Mar-a-Lago, people are not just worried about votes. They are worried about something. The idea that Donald Trump is a businessman is not true. A secret from 1968 has just come out. This is a secret that Donald Trump spent a lot of money to hide. What this secret says is really surprising. Donald Trump is the one who's worried. Donald Trump is the one who's scared. The secret is about Donald Trump. It is going to change what people think about Donald Trump. Stephen Colbert found some papers about Donald Trump. These papers are about Donald Trump's past. They are about what Donald Trump did a time ago. Donald Trump does not want people to know about these papers. Now everyone is going to know about them. Stephen Colbert knows how scared the Donald Trump camp is now. Stephen Colbert takes us back to a time ago, before the rallies, before the escalators. Stephen Colbert looks at all the things Donald Trump did to hide the truth, how far his friends went to make sure nobody looked too closely. Let us look at the facts. Stephen Colbert says we have Mike Johnson who did a job. We are always fighting against this. One thing the Democrats do is they stick together even when they think something is really bad. Stephen Colbert always says they impeached Donald Trump and he did not think it was right. They did it. Nobody even knew it was going to happen. It is very unfair. They say it is unfair. They say they will do it once and then go back to how it was. Listen to how they talk, the fear of being found out, the fear of being treated. This is something that goes back to when Donald Trump was young. Hi, guys. How is everybody doing? Good. Is everything going well? Yeah. How are you doing? What is your name, Sasha? My name is Sasha. I have a friend named Sasha. Behind the way people talk to each other in public, there is a big effort to hide the truth. Let us look at what happened at Donald Trump's school, the New York Military Academy. When Donald Trump was a teenager, his body was still growing. He was a grower. 8 years ago, the headmaster at the school was told to find Donald Trump's school records and hide them if a reporter tried to find out if Donald Trump could read, write, or spell. There would be no proof. Think about how much they wanted to hide this. Years ago, while everybody was looking at Donald Trump's life, important people were sending secret messages to the headmaster. The message was clear. Find the records, hide them, and make sure nobody can find them. Make sure no investigator, no journalist, nobody can ever see what Donald Trump was like in school. Why? Because Donald Trump wants people to think he is very smart. Donald Trump asked President Barack Obama to show his records to prove he was not a student. This happens over and again. Everything Donald Trump says about people, he is guilty of himself. Oh my God, people said Donald Trump was born in Kenya. This is what happens when people try to make others look bad to hide their weaknesses. Demand that people show their records, their birth certificates, and say they are not good enough. Why? To make sure people do not look at your weaknesses. Hiding the records at the New York Military Academy was just the beginning. As things got more serious, people got more desperate. Apparently, Donald Trump's friends who went to the school and were rich, they wanted the school superintendent to give them Donald Trump's records. He moved them to a different place on campus. Maybe someday somebody will find these report cards. Who knows what they might say? Maybe even his essay about what he did on his summer vacation. The rich donors put a lot of pressure on the superintendent. He knew how important this was, or maybe he was scared, so he did not give them the records. Instead, he moved them to a place on campus. A treasure trove of truth is hiding in the dark. While those old records are still hidden, something big was happening in Philadelphia, something that would change everything. All this is happening when Donald Trump is not very popular in America. 39% of people like him. The politicians are getting closer to him. The numbers are getting worse. The legal problems are getting bigger. In early 2026, Stephen Colbert showed something that had been hidden for 58 years. This was not a leak or a rumor. This was a thing from the past that connected the young Donald Trump to the man in the Oval Office today. Before this big news came out, politicians tried to distract people. Take a poll. You will see that people think Donald Trump is the worst politician ever. Take another poll. You will see that JD is the most annoying politician. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops just said that JD Vance is both annoying and stupid. Some people on TV are very mean. I mean, are they funny? This guy on CBS is mean. He said, "Hey, Mr. President, I will not let you talk about James Corden like that. He is very talented. Have you seen his carpool karaoke with Paul McCartney? Let us talk about Epstein. The powerful man in the world is hiding information about rich and famous people who did bad things. The news is always talking about this. The insults never stop. The distractions are made to keep people looking at the entertainment, the TV hosts, the scandals, anything to avoid the real problems. When the truth comes out, everything stops. Because while the news is talking about politics, Stephen Colbert did something. Stephen Colbert did not make fun of it. Stephen Colbert did not joke about it. Stephen Colbert showed the proof. Donald Trump's final exam from his business ethics class in the spring of 1968. Not a summary, the exam booklet. Blue cover, 14 pages, Donald Trump's handwriting and pen answering questions about responsibility, duty, and truth in advertising. Look closely at the picture of that booklet. It is the important thing in politics. The professor was Dr. William Evan, who taught at Wharton from 1964 until 1989. He died in 2003. Before he died, he kept this exam in a special folder labeled D. Trump, Spring 1968. He kept it, not filed it, not threw it away, kept it. His daughter found it when she was settling his estate in 2025. She did not know what to do with it until she read the note her father had attached to the page. Think about how important this. Dr. William Evan did not lose the paper. He did not put it in the university archives to be thrown away. He did not throw it away with thousands of student exams. He kept this 14-page booklet, wrote D. Trump in red marker, and said kept. He hid it away in his estate for 58 years until he died. He kept it because he knew what it meant. Stephen Colbert opened the booklet on his show, page 9. The question was, what is an executive's primary duty? Donald Trump answered, shareholders. The others do not matter if the money is not there. Truth is what you can prove. Ethics is what you can afford after profit. Read those words again. Let them sink in. Truth is what you can prove. Ethics is what you can afford after profit. This is not an answer on a test. This is a 21-year Donald Trump writing down what he believed. The professor's response was immediate and severe. He wrote, "This answer disqualifies you from understanding the course. D-, see me immediately. D-, the grade you can get without failing." The professor saw through the bravado. He did not just mark the answer wrong. He said the response disqualified the student from understanding ethics. What happened next is the scary part. There is no record that Donald Trump ever went to see the professor. He graduated 6 weeks later. The professor kept the exam because he was scared. The note attached to the exam said, student did not contest grade, did not come to office hours, graduated anyway. I am keeping this exam because I fear he meant every word. This is not a failure to understand ethics. This is a belief system. The professor was scared because the student was serious. This was not a lack of comprehension. This was a choice to reject the truth and morality. The professor realized he was not grading a kid who did not understand. He was documenting the birth of a force that would change the world. That is why the audience did not laugh. Stephen Colbert put the booklet on his desk under the lights. The audience did not laugh because the professor's fear in 1968 is like a diagnosis of how Donald Trump governs today. The silence in the room was deafening because suddenly every headline from the decade made sense. If you grew up in a time when business schools taught that companies had responsibilities beyond making money, this exam answer is different. It is not the view of someone who did not study. It is the view of someone who studied and rejected the premise. Shareholders only. Truth is what you can prove. Ethics after profit. That was not an answer on a test. It was a 21-year Donald Trump writing down what he believed. The professor saw it in 1968. He graded it D-. He wrote, "See me, Donald Trump never." The professor kept the exam because he understood something that the country would not see for decades. This was not immaturity. This was the plan. That is why the audience did not laugh. Stephen Colbert put the booklet on his desk under the lights. The audience did not laugh because the professor's fear in 1968 is like a diagnosis of how Donald Trump governs today. The silence in the room was deafening because suddenly every headline from the decade made sense. Stephen Colbert continued the segment with the same calm intensity that had defined the entire night. Stephen Colbert opened the booklet on air. Page 9. The question printed at the top in standard exam format: an executive's primary duty is to A, shareholders, B, employees, C, truth, or D, all equally. Defend your answer in 300 words or more. This is the exact moment the entire myth of Donald Trump shatters into a million pieces. This is not a multiple choice guess. This required a deep defense of one's personal and professional moral framework. And what did the young Donald Trump write? Donald Trump's response in his own handwriting, 14 lines of blue ink: shareholders only. The others do not matter if the money is not there. Truth is what you can prove. Ethics is what you can afford after profit. The successful executive prioritizes return on investment above all other considerations. Employees and truth are secondary variables dependent on financial performance. Read those words again. Let them sink into your mind. Truth is what you can prove. Ethics is what you can afford after profit. Truth are secondary variables. This is not a standard, poorly phrased academic answer. This is a cold, calculated manifesto written by a 21-year-old student who was showing the world exactly who he was going to be. It is the raw blueprint of a lifetime of behavior captured in faded blue ink on university paper. The response from the academic establishment was immediate, severe, and definitive. At the bottom of page 9 in red pen, the professor wrote, "This answer disqualifies you from understanding the entire course. D-. See me immediately. D-. The absolute bare minimum required to avoid failing the class entirely and blocking his graduation." The professor saw right through the bravado. He did not just mark the answer wrong, he explicitly stated that the response disqualified the student from understanding the core foundation of human ethics. But what happened next is where the true horror of the story lies. There is no record Donald Trump ever saw him. He graduated 6 weeks later. But here is why the professor kept it for 58 years. The paperclip note dated May 1968 in the same red pen. Student did not contest grade, did not come to office hours, graduated anyway. I am keeping this exam because I fear he meant every word. This is not a failure to understand ethics. This is a belief system. I fear he meant every word. That is the phrase that echoes through history. Dr. William Evan was not terrified because a student was lazy. He was not terrified because a student did not read the textbook. He was terrified because the student was entirely serious. This was not a lack of comprehension. This was a conscious, deliberate choice to reject the very concept of objective truth and human morality. The professor realized he was not grading an immature kid. He was documenting the birth of a psychological force that would eventually reshape the entire modern world. And that is exactly why the studio audience did not laugh. Stephen Colbert placed the booklet on his desk under the studio lights. The audience did not laugh because the professor's fear in 1968 reads like a diagnosis of how Donald Trump, now the sitting president of the United States in his second term, actually governs. The silence in that room was deafening because suddenly every headline from the last decade made perfect sense. If you grew up in an era when business schools taught that corporations had responsibilities beyond shareholders, when fiduciary duty meant something broader than quarterly earnings, this exam answer lands differently. It is not the worldview of someone who did not study. It is the worldview of someone who studied and rejected the premise. Shareholders only. Truth is what you can prove. Ethics after profit. That was not a wrong answer on a test. It was a 21-year-old Donald Trump writing down in his own hand the philosophy he would spend the next 58 years demonstrating in bankruptcies, in Trump University, in contractors, and paid in truth treated as a variable expense. Every single contractor who never got paid for their hard labor, every single student defrauded by Trump University, every single piece of political rhetoric that altered reality for millions of followers. It was all right there on page 9. Truth is not real. It is just a variable expense, a line item to be manipulated, discounted, or entirely erased based on the financial return of the day. The professor saw it in 1968. He graded it D-. He wrote, "See me immediately." Donald Trump never came, and the professor kept the exam in a folder marked "kept" because he understood something the rest of the country would not see for decades. This was not immaturity. This was the plan. And that is exactly why the studio audience did not laugh. Stephen Colbert placed the booklet on his desk under the studio lights. The audience did not laugh because the professor's fear in 1968 reads like a diagnosis of how Donald Trump, now the sitting president of the United States in his second term, actually governs. The silence in that room was deafening because suddenly every headline from the last decade made perfect sense. Stephen Colbert continued the segment by building on the visual evidence. Stephen Colbert showed the photo of Donald Trump leaning in as Epstein whispered in his ear once more. Stephen Colbert pointed out the body language again. Stephen Colbert noted how close they stood, how comfortable the moment appeared. Stephen Colbert said quietly that this was not how people interact with someone they barely know. This was how people interact with someone they trust in their personal space. Stephen Colbert replayed the denial from Donald Trump right after the image. The contrast hit harder the second time. The words from Donald Trump sounded even more disconnected from the visual proof. Stephen Colbert did not add commentary. Stephen Colbert let the audience feel the gap. The audience in the studio was completely engaged. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others nodded as if they were seeing something they had always suspected but never seen confirmed visually. Stephen Colbert kept the pace steady. Stephen Colbert moved to the next image, the one from the public event where Donald Trump and Epstein were both enjoying the attention. Stephen Colbert described it as a shared social world. Stephen Colbert reminded the audience that these were not random encounters. These were repeated interactions over time. Stephen Colbert replayed the denial from Donald Trump again. The repetition of the denial next to the repetition of the images created a powerful effect. The claim from Donald Trump started to feel rehearsed and fragile. Stephen Colbert then addressed the birthday letter report. Stephen Colbert placed it next to the photographs without dramatizing the content. Stephen Colbert simply noted that it existed and that it suggested a different level of familiarity than Donald Trump had claimed. Stephen Colbert was careful with language. Stephen Colbert did not accuse. Stephen Colbert presented. The audience appreciated the restraint because it made the evidence feel more credible. Stephen Colbert was not pushing an agenda. Stephen Colbert was showing a pattern. The pattern was clear. Donald Trump claimed distance. The evidence showed closeness. Donald Trump claimed insignificance. The evidence showed repeated social interaction. The gap was undeniable. Stephen Colbert moved to the fifth image, the unguarded private moment. Stephen Colbert let it sit on screen for a long time. Stephen Colbert said this one mattered because it captured a moment when Donald Trump and Epstein believed no one was watching. Stephen Colbert noted that people do not let their guard down like that with strangers. Stephen Colbert replayed the denial from Donald Trump once more. By this point, the denial sounded different to the audience. It sounded like it was trying to rewrite something the cameras had already recorded. Stephen Colbert did not need to say that out loud. The repetition did the work. Stephen Colbert then brought the segment back to the broader point. Stephen Colbert said this was not about assigning crimes. Stephen Colbert said this was not about guilt. Stephen Colbert said this was about honesty. Stephen Colbert reminded the audience that powerful people often rewrite history when they feel exposed. Stephen Colbert said they count on time to blur the details. Stephen Colbert said they bet that repetition will replace reality. But Stephen Colbert pointed out that evidence does not fade just because someone wants it to. Stephen Colbert ended the main part of the segment with one final sentence. You can deny facts. You can attack messengers. You can shout louder. But photographs do not argue. They do not care who is running for office. They just exist. The silence that followed was heavy. The audience did not erupt in applause immediately. They sat with the weight of what they had seen. Stephen Colbert had not raised his voice once. Stephen Colbert had not made wild accusations. Stephen Colbert had simply shown the past next to the present denial from Donald Trump and let the contrast speak for itself. That approach was more devastating than any shouting match could have been. The audience felt the power of quiet evidence. Within minutes of the segment ending, the internet reacted strongly. The clip spread rapidly, not because it was sensational, but because it was controlled and factual. Supporters of Donald Trump tried to counter it, but the photographs were difficult to dismiss. Cable news picked up the story quickly. Panels discussed the images, the body language, and the repeated denials from Donald Trump. The contradiction became the central point of discussion. Donald Trump had said he barely knew Epstein. The images showed repeated, comfortable interactions. That gap was hard to close. Donald Trump responded with anger on social media. Donald Trump attacked Stephen Colbert, the network, and the press. Donald Trump called it a smear campaign, but Donald Trump did not address the photographs directly. That absence was noted by commentators. When evidence exists, addressing it is the expected response. Avoiding it raises questions. The shouting from Donald Trump did not diminish the impact of the segment from Stephen Colbert. If anything, it highlighted the contrast between loud denial and quiet evidence. The segment from Stephen Colbert became a case study in how to challenge power without descending into chaos. Stephen Colbert had trusted the audience to see the mismatch for themselves. That trust made the message more powerful. People kept coming back to the clip because it felt fair. It felt factual. It felt like something worth thinking about. The photographs did not disappear. The denial from Donald Trump did not erase them. The gap remained, and that gap became the story. Stephen Colbert had created a moment that refused to fade. The segment from Stephen Colbert did not rely on outrage or personal attacks. Stephen Colbert relied on juxtaposition. Stephen Colbert placed the words from Donald Trump next to the images and let the audience see the difference. That simple approach proved more effective than any dramatic confrontation could have been. The public kept returning to the same question. If the relationship was so insignificant, why do the photographs show such comfort and familiarity? That question did not go away. It lingered because the evidence lingered. Media outlets continued to analyze the segment from Stephen Colbert. They noted how Stephen Colbert had refused to escalate. Stephen Colbert had refused to moralize. Stephen Colbert had simply presented. That restraint made the evidence stronger. Commentators pointed out that in an age of constant noise, quiet contrast stands out. Stephen Colbert had demonstrated that power. The denial from Donald Trump sounded different when played against the visual record. The repetition of the denial started to feel like an attempt to overwrite reality rather than describe it. Donald Trump continued his pattern of response. Donald Trump attacked the media. Donald Trump attacked Stephen Colbert. Donald Trump repeated the claim of distance. But the photographs remained. The body language in those images remained. The comfort in those private moments remained. The gap between the claim from Donald Trump and the visual evidence remained. Supporters tried to defend Donald Trump, but the defense shifted over time. Some moved from he barely knew him to he knew him socially, but that means nothing. The goalposts moved because the original position had become difficult to maintain against the evidence. The segment from Stephen Colbert became a lesson in modern communication. Loud denial works until it meets permanent record. Repetition works until it meets visual proof. Anger works until it meets calm presentation. Stephen Colbert had shown the difference. The segment did not need to shout. It simply showed. And showing in the age of endless noise turned out to be the most powerful thing of all. The public saw the denial from Donald Trump. The public saw the photographs. The public saw the gap. Once seen, that gap was hard to unsee. Stephen Colbert had not destroyed a reputation with outrage. Stephen Colbert had simply refused to let the past be rewritten without challenge. The quiet contrast did what loud attacks never could. It lingered. It made people pause. It made them look again. And looking again is where doubt begins. Doubt is more dangerous to power than anger because anger can be directed. Doubt spreads quietly and undermines trust from within. The moment became cultural shorthand. People referred to it as the night the denial met the photographs. The segment from Stephen Colbert was replayed not for entertainment, but for clarity. It reminded viewers that evidence exists independently of spin. Donald Trump could attack the messenger. Donald Trump could shout louder, but the photographs did not argue back. They simply existed. And existence in the end proved stronger than denial. Stephen Colbert had trusted the audience. Stephen Colbert had shown rather than told. That trust created a more lasting impact. People felt they had seen the truth for themselves rather than being told what to believe. That feeling of personal discovery made the segment powerful long after it ended. The denial from Donald Trump continued, but it rang hollow against the visual record. The story did not end with outrage. It ended with recognition. And recognition, once planted, grows on its own. In the days that followed, the conversation expanded. People discussed not just the specific relationship, but the broader pattern of powerful people rewriting history. Stephen Colbert had tapped into something deeper than one denial. Stephen Colbert had shown how evidence challenges narrative control. The segment became a reference point for future discussions about credibility and power. The photographs did not fade. The questions did not disappear. The gap remained visible. Stephen Colbert had succeeded not by being louder than Donald Trump, but by being clearer. In a world full of shouting, clarity cuts through. The segment from Stephen Colbert did not need drama. It needed honesty. And honesty paired with evidence proved more compelling than any insult or denial. The public had seen the past. The public had heard the present claim. The public had drawn its own conclusions. That is the power of contrast. That is the power of letting evidence speak. And that is why this moment from Stephen Colbert did not fade. It simply stayed quiet, visible, and undeniable. The myth of the brilliant businessman was gone. What remained was the record, and the record did not lie. Donald Trump had spent decades crafting an image. Stephen Colbert had spent one night holding up a mirror. The reflection changed everything. The audience had seen the denial from Donald Trump. The audience had seen the records. The audience had drawn its own conclusions. That is the power of contrast. That is the power of letting evidence speak. And that is why this moment from Stephen Colbert did not fade. It simply stayed quiet, visible, and undeniable.